There, this first section of the video is all about the composition of blood. That means what is blood made of. So it divides into 4 parts. So I always do it as a kind of grid divided into 4 with the 4 components. So the first component is red blood cells. The second one is white blood cells. Next one is platelets. And finally, plasma. So if you learn nothing else, learn those 4 headings. Right, so the detail then of each one. So first of all, red blood cells. So red blood cells, they have another name, which is erythrocytes. So don't let that throw you if you see them called erythrocytes. It's just another name for red blood cells. And they contain a pigment called hemoglobin. And the hemoglobin is what binds to the oxygen to carry oxygen around your body. Okay, so they contain hemoglobin, which binds to oxygen and therefore carries oxygen around your body. Now, white blood cells have another name as well. They're also called leukocytes. And they've got a different job. They don't carry oxygen. They're involved in our immune response, our immune system. And we've got different types. So we've got lymphocytes, first of all. And lymphocytes are the type of white blood cell that make antibodies. And then we've got another type called phagocytes. And the phagocytes are the type that engulf things like bacteria. So if we get infected by bacteria, our phagocytes will engulf them by something called phagocytosis. You will have done that GCSE, but if you don't remember, they kind of like wrap themselves around the pathogen like this, and then they become enclosed in a little vesicle and they can digest it with their enzymes. Okay, so white blood cells, the fancy name for white blood cells in general is leukocytes. And then we've got 2 types of white blood cells, lymphocytes and phagocytes. And the lymphocytes are the ones that make antibodies, and the phagocytes are the ones that engulf anything foreign. They recognize that something's non-self. We call non-self things in the body foreign. And it recognizes anything that's not your own cells and engulfs it. The platelets have a fancy name as well. So the platelets are called thrombocytes. And platelets are responsible for clotting your blood. So when you get a cut, they stick the blood together to form a scab so that you don't keep bleeding. And they can do that on the outside of your body when you get a cut to your skin, but equally they can do it inside your body as well. Okay, so when there's any kind of injury to your blood vessel, when a blood vessel gets damaged, it causes your platelets to come into action. So what they do is they basically stick together and form a little blood clot to prevent you losing any more blood. So blood vessel damage causes platelets to stick together to form a clot. So a blood clot is just when the blood cells all stick together using the platelets so that you don't keep bleeding, so it prevents bleeding. Okay, and the final part is the plasma. Now, plasma is the liquid part of your blood, okay, and it does carry around all the other things. So it contains The other three things that we've talked about, so red blood cells, just write RBC, red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and it also contains a few other things dissolved in it. So it contains dissolved oxygen, dissolved carbon dioxide, glucose, run out of space, right down here, amino acids, and hormones. Squeeze in there. Okay, so it contains these three other types of blood cells, which we've talked about already, but it also contains some other parts, other things dissolved in it as well. Okay, so that's our blood, and you've come across blood before, and we hear about blood day to day, but we actually have other liquids in our body as well, which we'll go on to talk about next. So the next type of liquid that we're going to look at is called tissue fluid. So that's blood with the four components. The next type is tissue fluid. So tissue fluid is a little bit different, and you might not have heard of it before. It's not talked about much in everyday life. I don't think most people probably even know it exists. But it's another liquid in our body that we have lots and lots and lots of. So if you imagine our blood vessels. So coming from our heart, remember we've got our arterioles, and then we've got, our arteries, then our arterioles, then our capillaries, then our venules, then our veins. So if we zoom in, first of all, on the capillaries, this is what we call a capillary network, when the capillaries are kind of all around the cells, delivering stuff basically to our cells. So let's draw that out. Okay, the tube that the capillary network came from will be an arteriole, and the one it's going back to will be a venule. So we've got an arteriole here, then we've got a capillary here, then we've got a venule here, and our blood is going this way. So it can go obviously any direction around here, and then this way through the venule back to the vein. So this would have come from an artery from the heart, and then this would go back into a vein, back to the heart again. Now we know that what happens in the capillary is that oxygen diffuses to our cells. So let's draw ourselves some cells. So every single cell in your body respires, that means it does respiration all of the time. So all of these cells here are respiring, and that means they need oxygen. So what happens is the oxygen comes out through these thin capillary walls and into the cells. So here comes the oxygen into our cells by diffusion, high concentration to low concentration, into the cells. Now, what we haven't mentioned so far is that all of this area here, all of this area here, let me just make that a bit bigger so it's a bit quicker. All of this area here is filled with another liquid that we haven't mentioned. So all around the cells here, in all this space, all of this is liquid, and this liquid is tissue fluid. So surrounding all of our cells, we've got our tissue fluid. All around here, tissue fluid. So the liquid in the blood vessels, in the arteries, in the arterioles, in the capillaries, venules, veins, that's all blood, which has the four components we just looked at. But this yellow liquid here is tissue fluid. So the tissue fluid is the liquid that surrounds all of our cells. Okay, so the oxygen comes out of the veins into the tissue fluid and then into our cells. And remember, our cells are respiring, and respiration makes carbon dioxide. So coming out of these cells will be carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide will go into the tissue fluid and then back into the blood again. Okay, so the carbon dioxide will go in the other direction, like this. So the oxygen is coming from the blood to the tissue fluid to the cells. The cells respire, they make carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide goes from the cells back to the tissue fluid, back into the blood. So that's what tissue fluid is. So let's write down how things move. So oxygen, first of all, starts off obviously in your lungs, and then it goes from the alveoli into the blood, and it goes from the blood, which is in a capillary. Then it goes through the capillary wall. Remember that the capillary wall is very thin, one cell thick, and remember that those cells are not even normal cells, they're squamous cells. Remember, squamous cells means flattened cells like this. So it's a really short diffusion pathway. Okay, so they go through the capillary wall and then they end up in the tissue fluid. Then from the tissue fluid, then it can go into the cells. Okay, the cells need oxygen for respiration. And then remember that respiration makes carbon dioxide. So in the cells still, respiration makes CO2. So this carbon dioxide is going to go the other way. So from the cells to the tissue fluid, through the capillary wall, back into the blood capillary, and taken back to the lungs to be breathed out. So the oxygen is going one way, the oxygen's going this way, and the carbon dioxide is coming the other way. All right, so the next thing we need to know about is how does the tissue fluid actually form from the blood in the capillary? Like, what is it actually made of? Okay, so how does the tissue fluid actually form? So what we're going to do is we're going to zoom in on one capillary. Okay, so let's say this is one of the little capillaries from our capillary network. Now, the end that's come from the arteriole is called the arterial end. And the end that goes then towards the veins, towards the venule, is called the venous end. And down here, we've got all our cells that are respiring. So they need oxygen and they need to get rid of their carbon dioxide. So what happens is we've got two types of pressure pushing the liquid plasma part of the blood out. Now, the capillaries, if you remember, are made of these squamous epithelial cells. So if we were to draw those squamous epithelial cells in the capillary wall, they would look something like this. Now, there are actually tiny little gaps. The oxygen and the carbon dioxide that diffuse through don't actually go what's it doing? Don't actually go through these cells. They actually go through the little tiny gaps in between these cells. We've got a layer of squamous epithelial cells, something like that. Really, they're like individual cells, obviously, more like that, but just saving time drawing them like this. So the oxygen and the carbon dioxide diffuse through the capillary wall by fitting through the little tiny gaps between these squamous cells. So our carbon dioxide is made in the cells and it needs to go back, okay, and the oxygen needs to come this way. But actually, it's not just the gases that diffuse through, it's actually liquid because we need a liquid to actually make the tissue fluid. So remember that in our blood, it's our blood that goes through the capillary, isn't it? and out the other end. Our blood is made of 4 components: plasma, platelets, red blood cells, white blood cells. And the plasma part, the liquid part, can come out through these little gaps, carrying the oxygen and the carbon dioxide with it. So it's not just oxygen and carbon dioxide that's coming across, it's actually the plasma, the liquid part of the blood, diffuses out. And as soon as it's out of the capillary, it's not called plasma anymore, it's now called tissue fluid. So the plasma becomes tissue fluid. Okay, so at this end, at the arterial end of the capillary, the plasma is pushed out of the capillary through these little gaps between the squamous cells. It carries with it oxygen, and the oxygen can then diffuse into the cells for respiration. The cells respire, they release carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide dissolves in the tissue fluid, and at the venous end, that tissue fluid gets forced back into the capillary, and once it's gone through, it's then called plasma again. Okay, so the plasma is forced out, and as soon as it's out, it's called tissue fluid, and then the tissue fluid is forced back in, and once it's inside, it's called plasma. Okay, so that's the first part of it. So blood comes along the capillary. The plasma part of the blood is squeezed out of or forced out of the capillary into this space between the cells. And as soon as it's out of the capillary, it's called tissue fluid. The tissue fluid then moves around and bathes all around all of these cells in all of this space. And the oxygen diffuses from the tissue fluid into the cells. The cells respire, produce carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide diffuses into the tissue fluid, and the tissue fluid is forced back into the capillary at the venous end. Now, I mentioned before that there's actually some types of pressure involved in this. Now, we've got 2 types of pressure that we need to know. The first one is called hydrostatic pressure. And the second type of pressure that we need to know is called oncotic pressure. Now, hydrostatic pressure, first of all, is simply hydrostatic is just where large volume of water is going to have a large pressure on the walls of whatever it's in. So if we've got a large volume of water, of liquid, of plasma inside a blood vessel, it's squeezed into a little tiny capillary, then there's going to be a high hydrostatic pressure in that capillary. If we're looking at the tissue fluid area around the cells at the arterial end, there's not much tissue fluid there at the moment. There's not much liquid there. So it's going to have a low hydrostatic pressure. Okay, so if I was to draw the capillary again, this is the arterial end. What you would see is a really large hydrostatic pressure pushing the blood out, okay, because you've got high hydrostatic pressure in the capillary, and because there's a lot of volume of liquid in there, and you've got a low hydrostatic pressure outside the capillary where the tissue fluid is, and therefore that pressure gradient goes from high pressure to low pressure, and that's going to force the liquid, the plasma from the blood, out of the capillary. And remember, as soon as it's out, then it's called tissue fluid. So that's what causes the tissue fluid to come out. Now, that's not the only pressure that we've got involved in this. We've also got the oncotic pressure. So if we go back to this one, the oncotic pressure, this second pressure here, is basically where it goes from where it's mostly water to where there's a lot of other solutes in the liquid. So if you imagine in the blood, there's a lot of other stuff in the blood. We've got the proteins, for example, but we've also got other molecules in the blood. There's lots of stuff other than water, other than liquid in the capillary. Okay, whereas in the tissue fluid, the only things that really can come out are things like oxygen and glucose and carbon dioxide, very, very small molecules. So there's not very many solutes there. So what we find is if we look at our capillary here, let's just move this back over. At the arterial end, we always seem to have more solutes in the capillary and less solutes outside the capillary. And the oncotic pressure always goes towards where there's more solutes. So it's quite a small pressure, but we've got a small pressure going that way. Okay, and that's called the oncotic pressure. And the interesting thing about the oncotic pressure is that it's the same at each end. Okay, so even at the venous end of the capillary, that oncotic pressure is about the same size, and I'll show that by drawing a similar sized arrow. Okay, so the oncotic pressure is still pushing inwards. Now, at the arterial end, the pressure of the hydrostatic pressure created is much greater than the oncotic pressure. So overall, more liquid is forced out, and it forms the tissue fluid. So at this end, we can say tissue fluid forms. Because overall, liquid, the plasma part of the blood, is being forced out of the capillary into this area around the cells, so it forms a tissue fluid. At this end, it's a little bit different because the hydrostatic pressure changes because the plasma is coming out, coming out, coming out, coming out, and actually the volume of water outside the capillary here is actually getting really high. So by the time we get to this end, we've actually got a higher hydrostatic pressure outside the capillary than inside. And so this arrow that was pointing outwards is now going to force liquid inwards. Okay, so overall, at this end, the tissue fluid is disappearing. The tissue fluid is disappearing back into the capillary. Remember, it's never called tissue fluid once it's in the capillary, it's then renamed blood plasma. Okay, so at this end, at the arterial end, we form the tissue fluid due to a result of the hydrostatic and the oncotic pressure. And at the venous end, the tissue fluid is moved back into the capillary, and we end up with less tissue fluid at the venous end. Now, what we don't end up with, however, is no tissue fluid. There is always some tissue fluid left. We don't manage to get all of it back just due to the way the pressures work out. So there is one more part to this story. So the final part of this is how do we get the last bit of tissue fluid back into our blood system, into our circulatory system? So far, as a little recap, let's draw our capillary again. So here's our capillary. At the arterial end, the liquid part of the blood, the plasma, diffused out of the capillary to form a liquid out here, which we call tissue fluid. That brought with it the oxygen and glucose that the cells needed for respiration. So the oxygen diffused into the cell and the glucose. The respiration produced carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide then dissolved back into the tissue fluid. Now, most of the tissue fluid then returned to the capillary where it turned back into or got renamed plasma and continued on in the capillary in the blood. However, some of the tissue fluid got left behind, and that tissue fluid goes into another system that we haven't probably learnt about before. And this system is called the lymphatic system. Okay, so the liquid is called lymph. So once this extra tissue fluid goes back into this vessel, it's then renamed lymph. The actual vessel is called a lymphatic vessel and is part of the lymphatic system. And that's where our last bit of tissue fluid goes. And eventually, this lymph vessel will join up with the blood vessels. So this one here could be a blood vessel. Oops, sorry. So this could be a blood vessel coming along here. This could be a lymphatic vessel coming along here. And eventually the lymphatic vessel will join kin to the blood and get renamed blood again. Okay, so the lymph liquid rejoins the blood in a blood vessel and goes on its way. So eventually that tissue fluid does become blood again. That liquid goes back into blood vessels again and rejoins. Now, something to do with the lymphatic system that you might have heard of before is lymph nodes. Okay, now your lymph nodes are part of your body that makes the lymphocytes. Now, if you remember back to our slide about blood, where was that? Just here. One of the types of white blood cells was called lymphocytes. And that's where that name comes from. So your lymph nodes, part of your lymph system, sorry, not nodes, writing and talking at the same time makes me make mistakes. So your lymph nodes is where lymphocytes, which were the white blood cells that made antibodies, is where they are made. Okay, so lymph actually has lots of lymphocytes in because as the lymph vessels go around your body, they pass by these lymph nodes which add lymphocytes in, and then it feeds back into your blood vessel. So your blood has lymphocytes in as well, and that's where they come from, which is really interesting. So let's just make sure we've got our key things straight. So we need to know about blood. And for blood, we need to know the 4 components: red blood cells, white blood cells, tissue fluid. What am I saying? Red blood cells, let's write them down. Red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and plasma. Then we need to know about tissue fluid, that's our second liquid. And we need to know where our tissue fluid is, and that basically it delivers oxygen to the cells, removes carbon dioxide, and we need to know how that forms. And then we need to know a little bit about lymph and how our lymph then carries excess tissue fluid back to the blood. Back to the blood vessels to complete the cycle. Okay, so we've actually got 3 liquids in our body: blood, tissue fluid, and lymph. So make sure you know the 3 of those.